Our text this morning is Romans 13. If you have a Bible and you want to turn there, or if you pull it up on your Bible app, it's also in the handout. It should have been on your seat. Romans 13, verses 1 through 5. Let me begin by reading that text. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. In her provocative paper, The Impulse to Punish, a critique of retributive justice, Devika Agrawal, who is a doctoral student at the university, or at Harvard University, asks us to imagine two distinct societies, each with a dramatically different response to crime, and part of her paper is in the handout. The first society, she says, punishes wrongdoers by placing them in prisons, indistinguishable gray blocks with minuscule quarters, strict surveillance, scheduled hours of unstimulating, unpaid work, and a squadron of guards packed with moral condemnation and weapons of intimidation. Long sentences are given, where a significant portion of inmates spend decades in these confines without release, and a minor portion is even sentenced to death. Due to long sentences, the prisons are overflowing. Due to overcrowded quarters, more prisons are built, and huge expenditures are made on behalf of the state. The general philosophy of the prison system is to ensure that all wrongdoers receive the punishment they deserve. In the second society, criminals can expect to make amends by serving time in an institution surrounded by nature and guards bearing no arms. Each criminal must thoroughly immerse himself in work, such as organic farming, shepherding, or mechanics, for which they get compensated the same amount as they would outside the institute. In addition to a steady income, they have the option to study any subject of their choice. Criminals may have access to all educational resources necessary, and they may leave prison with a notable degree in whichever field pursued, such as biology, business, or law. In this institution, they can expect all the amenities of home, like cooking supplies, a library, televisions, gaming stations, music, art, and even ashtrays for their cigarettes. Their quarters resemble college dormitories, fully equipped with bathrooms and mirrors. If they live peacefully, without problems, they have the choice to move to better institutions where they can live in proper houses with roommates. Social workers frequent the locale to assist criminals re-enter their communities by finding homes and jobs and providing emotional support. The general philosophy of the Institute is to ensure that all wrongdoers have the chance to grow and meet their true potential as members of a normative community. What is interesting about Agrawal's scenarios is that far from being imaginary, they represent two opposing systems of punishment that currently exist. The first, of course, refers to the prison systems in the United States, and the second, rehabilitation centers in Norway. And so what Agrawal is doing in her paper is not just comparing two prisons, what she's really doing is comparing two societies. The point she's making, and I think it's the right one, is that the kind of prison that you have is representative of the kind of society that you have. The moral fiber or standing of the society is reflected in the form of prison. And according to our author, the superiority of the Norwegian system is significant. In fact, I think she expects for you to read what we just read and come away with automatically saying, well, of course, that sounds like a much better system. And so what I want to do this morning is as we look at this particular text, is to defend the biblical philosophy of justice, what's called retributive justice, as opposed to the kind of justice that Agrau and so many others are putting forward. And in doing so, I don't want to give the impression that I necessarily agree with everything that the American prison system does, or that there is no need for improvement in our prison system. But generally, my evaluation is going to be with the philosophy that underlies these two particular prison systems. Agrau's philosophy of justice is what C.S. Lewis called the humanitarian view, or at least it has many of the same features of that view. And in Scandinavia, it threatens to replace the biblical concept of retributive punishment, an approach which is now more and more considered to be barbarous, the idea of being punished for what you deserve. Under the old practice of punitive justice, those who deliberately disturbed the peace and brought injury or damage upon their neighbor would be punished in ways appropriate to the offense. And punished in terms of beyond just paying restitution. Oftentimes people think that restitution is a punishment, but restitution is not a punishment, it's just giving back what it is that you have taken. So this system says you actually have to be punished beyond restitution. For example, in ancient Israel, such punishment could take the form of payment in kind. So if you stole someone's ox, you would have to give 2 oxen in return. Or it could take the form of money, in which you would have to repay 7-fold the amount that you had stolen. Or it might take the form of bodily harm in a beating that you might receive, as well as the practice of what's called lex talionis, or an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which in the Jewish system was really a limiting principle, to say you can't go beyond taking from someone else, in that sense, what they've taken from you. And of course, in extreme cases, punishment could come in the form of banishment from the altar and banishment from the community of God, and even capital punishment could be inflicted. Thus, the primary purpose of punishment in this model is to render to the wrongdoer his just deserts. And it's exactly that kind of retributive justice that civil authorities are to carry out in the Christian dispensation. It's what Paul speaks about in our text in Romans 13. Again, he says in verse 4, "For the civil authorities are God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for they do not bear the sword in vain." Bear the sword there is language for the authority to punish, and in particular, in this case, with regards to capital punishment. "For they are the servants of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." So in Paul's mind, the law of society, when properly chosen, these laws are a reflection of the perfect moral character of the infinite holy God. Now, in this case, my understanding of Paul's teaching is that he's talking about civil laws here. He's not talking about the imposition of religious laws, even I don't think in theory, because certainly in actuality he was under Roman rule at this time. But how I understand the Scriptures is that the building of a theocracy that we find in the Old Covenant, that came to an end at Pentecost. And perhaps the most dramatic symbol of that being the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So in my understanding, when Paul talks about the civil authorities, he's talking about civil laws. And thus, the point being is that when a wrongdoer is punished in this view, the civil authority becomes an instrument of God's retribution. So if you disobey the magistrate, you are disobeying God, and thus you incur his judgment. So you notice in this system, it's God who is ultimately punishing the wrongdoer, not man. And therefore, what ethically grounds this retributive model is God himself. Absent God, these kinds of practices of punishment, in whatever form they take, seem to lack that kind of sufficient grounding, which is one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of secular social contract theories of ethics, which is very prominent today, where we get together and we form a country or a union and we say these are the rules that we're going to have, and we're going to hold each other to these rules, and it's done absent any kind of transcendental anchor. It's absent God as the ground of it. I don't think such systems are sufficiently grounded, and therefore their moral permissibility is in question. As Paul says here, notice in our text, he says, there is no authority except from God. So absent God, I'm not sure how you can really justify any kind of authority in that sense. To me, it seems like what we have left is then just a free-for-all, and perhaps the postmoderns are right in the sense of, with the absence of God, what we just have is one form oppressing another. Now, in the time in which we live, in late modernity, we value this concept, this biblical concept of retributive justice less and less. And this is even true among many Christians. As I said, I think Agrala's point in starting her paper the way that she did, that we read, is she wants you, as you read that, to say, yeah, that's right. This other system of justice is much better, the humanitarian system, than the retributive one. And that really is where our culture is headed and has been for quite some time. We consider it, this kind of retributive justice, to be nothing more than the cruel practice of a primitive society, that we've evolved in our ethos, and so we place more and more emphasis upon mercy than upon punishment. What's interesting about that, it's not the kind of mercy, though, that the scriptures talk about, which tempers justice, right? It's not the mercy that you find in, for example, Psalm 85:10, in which mercy is personified as a woman who goes out and meets and then kisses righteousness. If you remember from a few weeks ago, this sermon from a few weeks ago, we talked about how these two are balanced in Scripture, the idea of justice and mercy, or punishment. And mercy have to be balanced. You can't have one without the other. But the late modern notion of mercy is one that really wants to be set free from any kind of righteousness. In fact, it looks down upon traditional concepts of justice in this sense. In fact, it seems to be appalled by traditional ideas of justice, and it's opposed to it. So the first point being is that it's not just in Europe that an ideological shift toward this humanitarian form of justice is occurring. In fact, there's been a slow transition in America towards it, and now I think it's picking up and it's moving forward at light speed. But this slow movement has actually been happening for decades. Let me give you an example of that. It's not without purpose that we've changed the way we refer to prisons. Has anybody noticed this? Right? They used to be called penitentiaries, which comes from the word penance, right? It's a place to do penance. It's a place to be punished for your sins. Now we call them correctional facilities, which is to say that it's a place where bad behavior can be corrected. That kind of radical change to the name of our institutions is not insignificant. Rather, what it reflects is a shift in our country's conception of justice. In other words, it represents a desire to change the purpose of our prisons away from the notion of retribution or punishment as a form of desert. Now let's talk about the humanitarian theory for a moment. According to the humanitarian theory, to punish a man because he deserves it, and to the extent that he deserves it, is nothing more than petty revenge. For the proponents of this enlightened view, the primary motive for confining a criminal then is rehabilitation, with a secondary motivation of security in order to prevent him from causing harm to other people. And there are various forms of this humanitarian approach to prisons, to the justice system. And the difference between them has to do with what the worldview is that underlies them. The one that really started to, the shift that started to happen towards this direction in the modern era, and I consider us living in sort of late modernity or postmodernity. But in modernity, the foundation for this was really the neo-Darwinian anthropology, the understanding of man as essentially just a biological machine who does what he does because of the DNA that he has, that man has no moral agency ultimately, that he is just a series of chemical reactions, and so it's a view that is utterly deterministic. There is no free will with man, and so all of the moral characteristics when it comes to prisons should be done away with, and you see this in Agral's language. He seems to disdain this idea that these people are condemned for committing these crimes and that should be shame that's heaped upon them for the evil things that they have done, because ultimately, in a sense, it's not really them. They don't have moral agency. They're just doing what their DNA tells them to do. And so the idea then of prisons should shift to just trying to retrain behavior. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to retrain behavior so that we can then reintroduce this species, this broken human being back into his environment without causing all of the problems. Now, interestingly, on the one hand, that's the grounding of it and what's pushing the movement forward. On the other hand, it's often filled with humanistic language. It's morality. They disdain the retributive model. It's evil and it's oppressive and all these things. It ruins human dignity, which are utterly inconsistent with this sort of Darwinian understanding of man, a strict Darwinian sense. Now, we've moved into the postmodern era, and so things have shifted somewhat. Now the emphasis seems to be, well, we still view man in a very Darwinian sense as just a material object, right? It's just a material being and nothing more. We've shifted to saying, but really what's causing his behavior now are social pressures, right? That what lies behind so much of the crime that takes place are these societal constraints, or the fact that the person is a member of an oppressed class is what's causing him to do these crimes, like being a member of a racial minority, or being someone who's poor, or an illegal alien, so on and so forth. And so it's not ultimately the fault, again, of the person who's committing these crimes. It's not their fault that they're looting and burning down their neighborhood, but rather it's the fault of society, because society has been oppressing them from the time they were born. I mean, there's 400 years of oppression that are resting on the shoulders of individuals, and so it's understandable why they are reacting in the way they are. They're trying to throw off the oppression that's upon them. So criminals are not really criminals, at least most of them. The white criminals are criminals, but most of the rest of people aren't. They're actually victims of oppression. And so consider that idea for a moment. In that instance, then, the idea of rehabilitation takes on the form of societal remediation, right? That if we could just make reparations for all the societal ills of the last 400 years, then we could eliminate crime, right? Eliminate it in total. And so from that point of view, how this has sort of morphed over the last, I guess, 30 years or so, and now it's just gone mainstream, essentially, is the path forward then in that view, because you're not dealing with the individual, right? We're just going to correct the individual. But this is a societal problem, right? It's the institutions themselves which are causing the problem, which are oppressing and creating the crime itself. Therefore, then the only solution is abolition, right? It's to destroy these institutions. They're worse than worthless, but they are actually guilty of creating the problem itself, and so we just need to get rid of them and start over. And I mean, how apropos this is. A panelist from the Democratic National Convention last week stated this, quote, "We're talking about abolishing the police." This is at the Democratic National Convention. We're talking about abolishing the police. We're talking about abolishing ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency. We're talking about abolishing prisons. And this individual invites the listener to share in her vision of a world without prisons. And she marvels at the fact that we lack the imagination to see this ideal society that doesn't have any prisons. And that seems like extreme rhetoric, and people would dismiss it and say, well, that person's just a kook. But just down the street in Austin, the city council just voted, under much pressure, to reduce the police budget by 1/3 and to use the money to fund social remediation programs, right? Like access to abortion, which I guess the thinking goes this way. Societal oppression leads to fornication, right? Having children out of wedlock, right? Which then leads to poverty, and then poverty always leads to crime, right? Because it's just, these are social pressures are what make you who you are only. And so, by the way, that seems to be kind of like committing a crime. Abortion is a way to try to prevent crime, which doesn't really seem to make any sense. But let me say this too. I think Here's one way to think about it. Think about how much dignity and respect is given to the fetus, right, to the baby that's in the mother's womb. How much dignity does this particular worldview assign to the baby? That's how much they actually assign to every human being. Okay? That's what makes this so dangerous. I'm going to try to prove that point in just a minute. But is any of this biblical? It is not. What it does is it denies the role of man's fallen nature and the role that that plays in behavior. It totally denies it. And again, because it's rooted in entirely materialistic anthropology. This is, a Karl Marx view of what man is. The Bible, in contrast, teaches that man has a soul, which is created in the image of God, the imago Dei. And therefore, number one, he has dignity, and he should be shown respect. But what it also tells us is that he has moral agency, and therefore then he has moral responsibility, which means that man's wicked behavior, unlike that of the beasts, warrants punishment. And the state, Paul says, is God's minister for carrying out that punishment. So from the Christian point of view, the problem ultimately is not that we are deprived, right? It's not that we have malformed genes or that we've been deprived opportunities and we're oppressed, but rather that we're depraved. That's the problem. That's where crime comes from. And that without civil restraints, without what's often called God's common grace, the world will quickly descend into the madness of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the reason why this vision, imagine a world in which there's no prisons. The reason why for Christians we have a real hard time with that, and that we actually find that vision to be frightening, is because we know how sick the human heart is. That without those kinds of civil restraints, then the evil heart of man will just be released to do whatever it pleases, and it will lead to absolute anarchy. And listen, you don't even have to be a Christian to know this. If you're a Christian, it's in the core teaching of Scripture, and you know it deep down if you study the Bible. But just being a student of history tells you this. The 20th century has a plethora of evidence pointing to how evil human beings can be. And so this sort of utopic vision really requires ignorance, even ignorance of recent history, for it to make any sense at all. Let me talk about, let me mention this. Interestingly, with this humanitarian approach to prisons, okay, there are studies, interestingly, which indicate that for at least some offenders, if you give them a choice between these two theories of justice, if you say, listen, we're either going to give you physical retribution, we're going to give you a beating, or you can go to this posh prison and experience rehabilitation, that people prefer the former to that. Now, why do you think that might be the case? Why would someone choose a beating over a chance to better himself, preferring inhumane treatment to humane treatment? Well, may I suggest that far from being humane, this so-called humanitarian approach to justice, when it's enacted consistently, is actually anything but a humanitarian effort. That when taken to its logical end, it will destroy the very thing that it promises to preserve, which is human dignity. Which is to say that there's a hidden assumption underlying this theory which needs to be exposed, besides from the one I just exposed, which is the worldview which undergirds it, this Darwinian view of man as a beast, man without moral agency, and therefore, man without the imago Dei, and therefore man with no dignity at all. That's one part of the problem. But there's also another part. It's sort of the lie that the humanitarian supporters never really talk about. And that's this, that things done to the criminal, even if we label them reparations, will be just as compulsory as they were in the old days when we called them punishments. If a tendency to steal can be cured by providing job training and a chance to earn a living, the thief will no doubt be forced to undergo such restitution. Otherwise, crime will run rampant and society will fall apart. I mean, after all, the purpose of these institutions is to form perfect citizens. And so notice that the reparations approach doesn't actually remove the concept of punishment at all. It just simply switches its form and the motivation behind it. But notice it's difficult to see how the need for remediation in and of itself provides a society the sufficient moral grounds for requiring it. Because think about it, just because someone needs to be freed from some social oppression doesn't mean we can force that kind of freedom upon them, unless we start to think in the very collectivist way of saying, well, he doesn't really have moral agency, and it doesn't really matter because he doesn't have moral dignity. So we can do anything we want to him for the betterment of society. So what do they do if the man remains resistant under this model? Right? Are they going to keep him locked up in rehabilitation, in the rehabilitation center indefinitely? So the humanitarian effort, when pushed to its logical end, terminates in the very worst kind of tyranny. The first C.S. Lewis quote in the handout, C.S. Lewis notes this truth. He says, "Of all tyrannies, the tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their consciences." So the old retributive model, which has desert as its motivation, terminates at the conclusion of the punishment. And while the punishment may or may not reform the man, I mean, it is true that godly sorrow can bring about repentance, Paul tells us, but it might not. But either way, there's no question as to whether or not he should receive it. He receives it because he deserves it, because it's his due, because justice demands it. And once justice is satisfied, then the punishment ends. The humanitarian method, on the other hand, is motivated by reform and safety. And so it should be carried out until such goals are achieved. Let me give you a test case for the humanitarian method, one that took place in Norway. On the 22nd of July in 2011, you may remember this, Anders Breivik, who is a Norwegian fascist, murdered 77 people in an organized terrorist attack. It was the deadliest mass murder in Norway's history. Now, he was deemed sane by the court. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to serve 21 years in prison in a 3-cell suite of rooms equipped with exercise gear, a television, and a laptop, the kind of cell you see a picture of in your handout. As I say, it looks like a college dormitory. So that's 100 days of posh prison time for each person that he murdered, with a legal release possible at age 53. By the way, this is the maximum sentence one can receive in the Norwegian court system. But notice the fact that criminals are still receiving sentences tells us that there is a remnant of the retributive model in the Norwegian system. For if the primary purpose is rehabilitation, there should be no time limits. Release should come only when transformation has taken place. So if Anders Breivik, who is a hardened ideologue, does not change his worldview after 21 years, and he is deemed to be just as dangerous as when he came in, then upon what grounds is he to be released? Merely because he served his sentence? Right? That sounds like the retributive model to me. It seems that not even the Norwegians have entirely purged the concept of punishment from their system, even though they disparage it at every chance they can. In fact, it seems to me that a monster like Breivik puts to test their humanitarian aspirations. Right? Most people will default to the retributive model when they're faced with the kind of evil that you find in Breivik. They will say, well, Hitler deserves to be punished. Right? It's only the lesser crimes when they start putting forward this humanitarian position. I'm hoping we're starting to see how dehumanizing this false view of punishment is. Besides from just being immoral, it makes a mockery of the notion of justice entirely. But it's an approach which treats man as if he were an animal, which is not surprising because that's the worldview it's based upon. But again, I quote from C.S. Lewis, "To be liberated against one's will from a state which he may not regard as enslaving is to be put on a level with those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants and domestic animals, to be punished, however severely, because we have deserved it. Because we ought to have known better is to be treated as a human person made in God's image. And so it's one thing for the civil authorities to say, what you've done is wrong, and we're going to punish you for it. It's another thing to say, you must agree with us that it's wrong, or your punishment will never end. The responsibility of the state, says Paul, is to punish wrongdoers. It's not to punish wrong thinkers. It is not to be engaged in the work, in other words, of rehabilitation, of changing someone's heart. Its job is to restrain evil, not to eliminate it, because you can't legislate the heart, as the old saying goes. It's from the heart that all evil comes. But the state can't change the heart. That's the job of the Spirit, through the church's proclamation of the gospel. And any state which attempts to engage in that kind of reformation without the Spirit, to try to do a job it was never designed to do, in the end must resort to totalitarian practices. And I'm afraid, brothers and sisters, this is the direction our country is headed. One last thing to say is this particular humanitarian approach, like so much of cultural Marxism, is often cloaked in the language of Christianity. It's sold to Christians by saying things like, didn't Jesus come to free the oppressed? Right? Isn't this what loving your neighbor is all about? Seemingly forgetting that when Jesus coming to set the captives free, the reason why people are captives in the first place, right, ultimately, is because of sin. In other words, the reason why they're facing oppression in this world, and I don't mean societal oppression, I mean the ultimate oppression of sin, what Jesus came to set us free from. The ultimate oppression, the reason why we're experiencing it, is because of our own rebellion. It's because we have moral agency, and we've chosen to use that agency to transgress God, to rebel against his kingdom, and we stand guilty in his law court. And he came to extend mercy to us, to take the punishment in his, take our punishment and stand in our place and satisfy justice for us. And so it's not a mercy that's separated from justice, but it's both of those, because there's coming a day in which justice is going to reign, in which God is going to come, and the time of mercy will run out forever.